Okay, so we're going to be talking about Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the funding that goes with that. So to start, I'm going to be talking about the background. So in the background, there was an act that was established to create and help make public education free for those that have disabilities. And then some interesting things that happened were there was pushes that were happening and that the students were left undeserved and unserved until 1975 to assure the free appropriate public education of all children with disabilities. There must have been an act signed in order to support those students in the classroom. And then this was hope, and the act was signed in hopes to present students with disabilities opportunities to express their talent and to their communities. And then the IDEA not only protects students who are in school, but they also benefit children from a young age. So I found a quote that said the IDEA upholds and protects the rights of infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities and their families. And on the side, I just put a visual. It just kind of talks about some things you would see in an IDEA classroom and some things you would include as part of a child or student that has an IDEA IEP in their act or in their schooling history or such. So just some things that you can look for in the classroom.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about IDEA in our classrooms and how this act influences us as teachers and how we teach our students. So next slide. So first, as teachers, we have an enormous responsibility to differentiate for our children. And Suzanne Plout, who is an educator and director of curriculum design for expeditionary learning, says that students want to succeed. It is their right to have the tools to do so. Our job as educators is to facilitate their drive and learn and equip them with the ability to think. We have to do this with intentionality. Next slide. And so these are some of the common ways that we have seen or probably have seen IDEA in our classrooms, and also goes along with that quote about students having the right to education and an equitable education. So I have a slide for each of these, but just briefly, individualized education plans, so IEPs, parent involvement, integrating students into a least restrictive environment, and confidentiality of student records. Next slide. So for one way that we would see it in our classroom is again through IEPs. The definition down here, especially for Oregon, is under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Oregon revised statuses and Oregon administrative rules. Each eligible student must have an individual education program, IEP, created not less than annually to plan for the provision of the free appropriate public education to which they are entitled. So funding for IDEA in our classrooms, we can see this with IEPs. And hopefully at this point in our program, we can all recognize how our students do benefit from this and why it is so crucial to have, which it does fall under IDEA. Next slide. So going along with IEP plans is parent involvement. So parent and student activist involvement. So parents now have a right to accept and decline any kind of assistance that their student is receiving. And that is the right of the parent, and this falls under IDEA. So perhaps we have had a challenge with this in parents choosing to not accept resources that are being recommended by their school, but that is their right, and they have this right under the IDEA. Next slide. Okay, so next is the least restrictive environment. We've probably all heard about this before, but we have a short clip that will hopefully remind us what the least restrictive environment is, which also falls under IDEA and is one of the many things that we have seen in our classrooms. So when you're ready, I'm gonna have you play that.
Least restrictive environment legislation has been around since the 1990s as one of the 6 principles under IDEA, for which the groundwork was laid in the 1970s. The controversy over how LRE is interpreted and practiced seems to be a topic of interest to this day. Many people use the term inclusion, but it seems as though most don't understand the true intent of the word. For example, some might say this student is going to inclusion class, as if inclusion were a place we enter and exit. In this context, we associate the term inclusion, and therefore LRE, with just a location. In doing so, it may be assumed that if we put the student in a certain location, that they have accessed their LRE. However, the intent of the law is quite different. Inclusion is not a place. Inclusion is a philosophy, just as LRE is not a place, but a package of supports and services that include elements of a setting, materials, accommodations, and personnel. Both LRE and inclusive philosophies are a foundation in the structure of best practices that ensures that all learners have access to meaningful education. The continuum of LREs is as vast as the needs and skills of the learners we teach. Each student needs individualized consideration for LRE based on his or her unique strengths and needs. Remember, LRE is not a place, but a range of services and supports that should be provided in general education settings as often as possible. Imagine a backpack containing all of the IEP team-determined supports and services, which a student can carry with them throughout the day. A student's supports and services package is individualized and includes their specific accommodations, modifications, tools, materials, and personnel. As the student transitions into and out of settings throughout the day, they should have this imaginary backpack with them no matter where they go. Ultimately, LRE determination should be made with these supports and services in place before moving to a more restrictive LRE. There are several critical elements in successful implementation of LRE, including IEP teams that decides LRE on a case-by-case basis, matching LRE with each learner's strengths and needs, use of universal design, differentiation, and assistive technologies, strategic use of all staff, paraprofessionals who are trained as independence coaches, and administration that build inclusive philosophies district-wide by modeling and expecting the use of people-first language and by providing time for collaborative planning practices that integrate content, function, and supports and services. Acceptance, belonging, participation, worth, and dignity. Isn't this what we want for all people? Modeling inclusive practices in youth paves the way for adults who value all people for who they are and the uniqueness each person brings to our society, workplace, and community. If we want better outcomes for individuals with disabilities to work and live side by side, we need to build the understanding early in life that each person has a unique set of needs that they bring with them everywhere they go. Two people completing the same job could use different methods and materials and still accomplish the same end result. Wouldn't it be nice if this were just the norm?
Okay, thanks for that. So LRE does fall under IDEA, which the video was helpful, I think, in describing that. And then lastly, an area that we probably have noticed IDEA in our classrooms is confidentiality. So some of my peers in the MAT program had some issues with this, not being able to attend IEP meetings at the beginning of the school year when RCTs weren't quite sure if we had the credentials to be able to have access to these confidential records. So confidentiality also falls under IDEA. And it's important to recognize these 4 things. So IEPs, LRE, parent involvement, and confidentiality, because for teachers, we will show up in different ways for our student in the ways that we differentiate. And it is through the funding that is provided for IDEA that allows us to do these things. And that's all.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So the next portion talks about the best practices. And the interesting thing about the IDEA policy is that there is a part B and there's a part C, but there is no part A. And each part focuses, like previously mentioned, on different age groups, and each of them have their own way of operating. So for example, part C They work with newborns all the way up to children that are 36 months, and then Part B, they're from ages 3 to 21. Part C, so that one is more of a family focused type group, and then Part B, that one focuses on the child's or the student's education. So, in order to implement a plan for an individual under the IDEA policy, there must be an investigation of their condition, and this is to create a plan that will benefit both the person, family, and teachers. In the case of Part C, under the IDEA policy, if the individual is younger than 36 months, there will be a different support systems or different support systems will be provided that heavily include the family, which is a very important distinction. This is to ensure that the best practices are being used to maintain a course that leads to an easier transition to public schools. For individuals that qualify for Part B services, meaning students in public schools, the approach is geared towards students rather than the family as a whole. There is also an investigation that seeks to determine what their needs are in order to succeed in the classroom. And yeah, so that's the first part. Rochelle, for the second part.
So there are 3 stages for the evaluation process to receive services. First, determine the cause for the evaluation. Next, get the child assessed. And last, review the results. There are 4 different components of assessments that will need to be completed. First is the developmental history. So the developmental history is records of the history of the child's detailed medical, educational, family, and social background gathering during the assessment. Accurate diagnosis of learning and attention disorders, for example, require ruling out medical causes for these concerns. The next one is cognitive assessment, which focuses on the detailed examination of learning skills, abilities, intelligence, and executive functions required for school success. The executive function includes measuring attention, memory, planning, and organizing. Next is the academic achievement. So that evaluates a multitude of tests such as basic reading, writing, and math skills. The child is assessed if they can apply these skills and work quickly and efficiently. Then comes the behavioral, social, and emotional. This assesses the child's behavioral strengths, challenges, interpersonal skills, and emotional life. Identifying the child's strengths, assets, and difficulties is an essential part of this process. And then for the evaluation results, all the results will be written up in the report, which the evaluator will discuss with the parents. The report will include recommendations as to what the next steps will be. All of the information is used to develop an IEP or a 504 plan. All right, next slide.
So for this portion, we found 3 recommendations that the U.S. Congress could do in the Department of Education and the state. So for the U.S. Congress, they could examine ways to help states and districts support and serve high-cost students. A second thing that they can do is explore ways to provide more flexibility in IDEA's MOE requirements that also protect student civil rights. And for the third one, they can authorize funding levels that gradually increase funding to the maximum amount of 40%. And for the other section is Rochelle.
Oh, go back one. Thank you. So for the U.S. Department of Education, the National Council on Disability first recommends a commitment to running frequent large-scale studies about the actual expenditure of special education to inform policy. Next, they recommend strengthening the association between IDEA funding and state compliancy requirements, in addition to utilizing their power to withhold funding from states' continual unaddressed nonconformity situations and finding. The National Council on Disabilities recommends states deliver greater disregard and support to districts to help increase federal funding streaming into schools and avoid caps, maximum level, other actions to resist services and support. Next, strictly oversee LEA compliancy with IDEA and utilize their authority to withhold funds until there is cooperation. Also, providing training and technical support to IEP teams on child find, FAPE, and LRE, which are research-based practices that support students' academic and behavioral needs. And last, to advocate for an increase in IDEA funding. Okay, next.
All right, and then with IDEA, of course, there are some tensions that come with that in regards to things like funding. So through the national regional focus groups and the national forum, it was reported by parents that schools and districts have openly admitted that resources are limited and therefore they are unable to provide comprehensive services and supports for children. And with that, the shortage comes in the form of, not having enough special education teachers or service providers, being some of the reasons why that they can't deliver these shortage services. And that's due to budget constraints and just, not enough people applying to the field. So Congress promised to cover 40% of the average costs that it takes to educate a student with a disability. But today, the federal government is only paying approximately 18% of that average cost. So that's over half of the money that these children are supposed to be seeing going towards their education isn't making it to them. And this is causing a ripple effect across the board, and it's creating tension within the school districts. And it's affecting not only the students, but the parents as well. Some parents are reporting that that after at an IEP meetings, principals, teachers, and other personnel have, privately admitted to them and apologized that they are unable to provide their child with these services. And again, it's back to resources and having certain caps and maximums placed on services in the schools. An example of this is that there was a student that was required 5 hours of service, that was given 5 hours of services a week, but had to be cut back down to 4 because the state will only pay for the 4. And 1 hour a week may not seem like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things for these students, that makes a big difference. And it's affecting them, it's affecting the schools, it's affecting the parents, and so it's a really big issue. And I think that is it. Thanks for watching our presentation.